Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this mental health resiliency for lawyers, CLE. If you'll notice, I did put in the chat box that this CLE has been approved for 1 hour of professional responsibility credit. I would ask that any questions go ahead and put into the chat box, and we will wrap up today at approximately 11:50 so that we can get to all your questions. And at this point, I will go ahead and hand it over to Sarah with Rosecrance. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate everyone who has taken the time today to join us for this presentation. As Heather said, my name is Sarah Reichwald. I'm the Director of Education and Staff Development for Rosecrance Health Network, and we're here today to talk a little bit about mental health resiliency. I also have joining me today, Purvi Shah, who is Rosecrance Director of Corporate Compliance and also an attorney. So I will be turning it over to her here in just a couple of moments, but I think we're going to hop right into the presentation. I know we got started just a few minutes late, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to cover all of the different pieces of the puzzle, as well as have some time for questions at the end. If anybody who's joining right now could just make sure that you put yourself on mute. Just a little bit, thanks. So we're going to go ahead and get started. This is our agenda for today. And we're going to talk a little bit about just some really quick pandemic experiences. Purvi is then going to speak just a little bit about some facts and figures that will be very relevant to all of you who are attorneys. And then we're going to hop into our content on resiliency. We're going to talk a little bit about how we define it, talk a little bit about the myths about resiliency that kind of float around, as well as how we can build resiliency. Putting some of that into context, we're going to talk a little bit about technology considerations, and then really looking at the reality behind resiliency and what it truly means as we move forward and kind of come through. I can't really hear you. So just to get us started, thought I'd share just a little bit about some common experiences that many people are going to associate with the pandemic. Some of this you may have experienced, some of it may be things that coworkers or peers or loved ones, friends of yours might have experienced, but really there's a lot that people have been going through in the past year, and we're certainly kind of nearing or getting closer to kind of finishing this out, like the presentation is titled, but really there's still a lot going on. And these can range from, just elevated stress, stronger feelings of anxiety, maybe a little bit of depression that creeps into people's minds as they try to manage the pandemic. There's a lot of people who are going to experience this pandemic as grief or loss, and not just because maybe you lost somebody close to you, but even people who have lost jobs, people who have lost sources of income. That can all be perceived, and people can experience that as grief and loss. And most of the time we associate that with, again, loss of life, which has obviously been the case with the pandemic, but it's not always limited to those kinds of experiences. So just like to make sure people recognize that. There's also some significant risk for increased alcohol and drug use at a time where you might feel like you're a little more isolated, or potentially working from home and doing some things and just not having a lot of opportunity externally. And so a lot of people then turn to substances. And in extreme cases, we might see, self-harm, suicide risk, and that tends to be more extreme, but it's certainly worth having, kind of on the radar. The reason that I like to just highlight these, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on the different areas, we're really going to jump into this resiliency content, but I like to highlight them because it just shows people how many different types of experiences one can have when you're kind of managing what's going on in the world around us. And no two people are really going to have the same kind of reaction to the pandemic and to the world around us. So just kind of like to put that in context because it'll help us frame our resiliency conversation here in a little bit. And I'm going now to just turn it over to Purvi Shah. As I mentioned before, she is the Rosecrans Director of Corporate Compliance. I'll give her an opportunity to introduce herself. She's going to share some facts and some information that'll be very relevant to all of you as attorneys.
Hi, everyone. Like Sarah said, my name is Purvi Shah. I just wanted to remind everyone, if you could please mute yourselves. I saw a couple things pop up in the chat box. So if you haven't had a chance to do it yet, please do mute yourself and be aware that your video might be on. So anyways, before joining Rosecrans and the very exciting world of healthcare compliance, I also worked in a firm environment, both at a criminal defense firm and later a medical malpractice firm. And what became apparent to me as a young attorney, and still now is very apparent to me 10 years into my career, is that some of that law school culture never ended, right? The stress is everywhere for us. Pre-COVID, many of us are in environments that are highly competitive. Our work is serious. We're dealing with people's lives every day. Many of us are type A by nature, and the hours can, of course, be so long. I think there's a couple of people on the call that are still in school. And for those of you that are still in school, you too, your classes are tough and demand a lot from you every single day. So as a profession, it's no surprise that we are highly stressed individuals. It's not surprising that 18 to 20% of attorneys engage in problematic drinking or have an alcohol use disorder, while the general population is around 8 to 10%. Attorneys working in private firms have a higher rate of problematic drinking than those working in other settings. A 2016 study on American attorneys found that 61% of participants reported past or current symptoms of anxiety, while 46% reported symptoms of depression. According to the American Psychological Association, lawyers are 3.6 times more likely to suffer from depression than non-lawyers. And then a recent survey for our law school attendees, a recent survey from Yale showed that 44% of law students exhibited significant levels of psychological distress. And another survey from the National Conference of Bar Examiners showed that 40% of law students reported binge drinking in the prior 2 weeks of completing that survey. So a while ago, I read this article that quoted a clinical psychologist who works with lawyers and stated that psychologist stated that lawyers tend to score higher on pessimistic thinking, which often results in higher success rates and becoming a better lawyer. However, this type of thinking is also highly correlated with depression. So those very same things that make us really good at our jobs can also predispose us to depression. And now on top of all of that, let's throw in the pandemic. So on top of our already very stressful jobs, we now have uncertainty with what's going on with the pandemic itself. We know our jobs are being affected, and a lot of us are working remotely, which can also be isolating. A lot of us make a living imagining the worst case scenario. So the stress of COVID is, of course, going to be impactful on our profession. There's an article that said COVID is especially concerning for attorneys because we like data, we like control, and we like predictability. But there's a lot about this pandemic that, of course, is out of our control and is unknown. So studies are showing that in the general population, rates of anxiety and depression have quadrupled between 2019 and 2020. And we can assume that the rates for attorneys are much higher as well. Drinking is also related to COVID-19 anxiety and depression. There's a study from the American Addiction Centers that about 1/3 of the people in the United States who are working at home during the pandemic, of course, including many attorneys, are drinking on the job. And the same study shows the alcohol sales are up 55% since March of 2020. So those are staggering statistics. We know that the pandemic is affecting those in our profession. So how do we move forward? We have the same, if not more, demands from work. and our roles are essential. We still need to show up for our clients and, handle ongoing matters. We might be able to show up through Zoom with cat filters, but we do have to show up. We still have personal life stressors as well, whether it's kids in odd school schedules or worrying about the health of loved ones, or just trying to keep social connections going. So what can we do? We as a profession need to be truthful with what we're experiencing with ourselves, and we need to keep an eye out for our peers and those we work with, and then take the steps we need to get help. One of the resources that's out there is the Illinois Lawyers Assistance Program that's 100% confidential, and that's available to law students as well as attorneys and judges, and can be used for yourself or for a colleague. In addition to these, there's also just mental health tips that we can utilize. And one of those tips is resiliency, is the concept of resiliency. And so I know Sarah is going to spend a lot of time talking to us about that, and I'll turn it over to her.
Thanks, Kirby. So I wanted to just kind of kick off this discussion about resiliency by just sharing some just kind of ideas about what it truly is, because there's a lot of people that throw around the term resiliency and don't necessarily have a ton of context for what it truly means. And so what I have up on the screen now, just some different definitions, just some different ways to think about resiliency. First, with it being an inner capacity that empowers people to meet challenges and stressors, essentially with a sense of self-determination, mastery, hope, and well-being as the focus. There are also a number of people and a lot of the research that talks about resiliency being your capability to stay stable, to mentally stay stable with mental health and other areas, despite having pretty strong exposure to a major stressor. And so if you think about COVID and what its impact has been on different people and different groups, it's essentially our way of being able to say, I can stay relatively stable with my mental health through this, and that would be a really clear indicator of resilience. The other thing that's really important to understand about resilience is that it's not static. It's certainly something that can ebb and flow. It's dynamic. It has multiple levels and layers to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the other thing that's a really important takeaway, and the science supports this and the social research supports this, it's the natural and normal human response to a traumatic experience. And so that's actually really good news. It means that our bodies and minds are equipped to deal with the chaos that we encounter, whether that be COVID or any other form of trauma. Resilience is a very natural response. And so again, that bodes well for all of us, because we know it's the way that our bodies and minds are designed. And so that's really good news, and it gives us a really good outlook for what resiliency can be and what it can mean for us. So I wanted to share just a couple of I put these in the category of myths, because they float around out there, and people sometimes assume them as fact. And one of the very first myths that I kind of came across about resiliency is that resilient people, if you kind of feel like you're resilient, or you recognize maybe a coworker or a peer just seems to have it together all the time, we sometimes envy those people, at least I do. And the myth is that they never have a bad day, right? That resilient people never have a bad day. And what we need to challenge with that a little bit is that even the most resilient person, so even that person that sits across from you in an office, or the neighbor that just seems to have it together all the time and never struggle, they probably do. And we should expect that people are going to have a bad day or negative emotion. There are going to be people that it should be fairly standard that yes, somewhere deep down, even if they present as together all the time, that negative emotions exist. What matters more isn't so much that people have those bad days or don't, it's what we actually choose to do with that when it does happen. So even if 99% of the time you are trucking along and you are kind of embodying all this resilience that we're going to talk about, if you struggle one day or you see somebody else struggling one day, that's definitely a thing. Nobody's resilient 100% of the time. What we choose to do with it is the important piece. And what I'll tell you is just a couple things that are good things to do with how you would respond. First of all, you don't want to bottle it up. That's one of the things that I hear from a lot of people is, like, no, I'm definitely okay. I'm doing great. I'm fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. Those kinds of statements. And those are people who are struggling maybe to kind of say like, I am having a bad day, or I am struggling a little bit. You're going to be more resilient in the long run if you don't bottle some of that stuff up and you're willing to kind of have that conversation, even if it's with your significant other or your best friend or a sibling or a parent, to just say, you know what, today's not a good day. I know I'm good like 92% of the time, 98% of the time, and today's just not it. But, intentionally kind of, embracing some of that and recognizing that like it is okay to have a bad day. You can still be a resilient person and have a bad day. The second myth that I really think is important is there's a lot of information that kind of floats around out there where people think that you either are a resilient person or you're not. So it's either a characteristic or a trait that you have or you don't have. And actually what we're learning more and more about resiliency is that the research doesn't really support that kind of black and white, all or nothing thinking at all. And in fact, what the most recent kind of research on resiliency is showing is that social support and meaning making are the two strongest predictors of resiliency. So if you're intentional about developing social support, if you're intentional about finding meaning in the world and in the things around you, you're going to have a much greater capability and much greater ability to be resilient. Pre-existing mental health conditions and family history are actually extraordinarily unreliable predictors of resilience. And so I think about this one a lot because you always hear stories about people who kind of came from these really, maybe they grew up with in a really abusive situation or lived in poverty, or they were homeless, or they had all sorts of these bad things that, really happened to them in life. And they end up being extraordinarily resilient. And they are able to leverage some of that to end up very successful. And so it's interesting because all this latest research supports exactly that their family history isn't a good predictor of resilience. And that what happened to them maybe in childhood or what's happening to them right now is not necessarily a predictor of resilience. So when you combine those things, when you think about the social support and the adaptive meaning making, and you think about family history not being as linked to this as one might have thought, both of those really, in fact, suggest that resilience is actually a learned skill, or it can be acquired. It's not something that if you didn't have it when you were 12, you're never going to have it. I think that's really important right now with COVID and with everything that's happening in the world, to understand that even if you've never felt like you were a resilient person, you have an opportunity now to be one, because it's not an innate characteristic. It's definitely something that you can acquire over time and can be learned over the course of managing different situations. So I think those two things are really important as we start to think about then, what does resilience really mean in terms of how do we build it? How do we develop it? How are we able to kind of accomplish some of that stability that we talked about in the definition? So the slide I'm going to share now, it's a pyramid, obviously. They don't build on one another, though. I think it's important. I like to have graphics, but one of these doesn't necessarily have to build on the other in order for you to have resilience. So it's not designed to be like a step ladder, if you will, or something like that. It's really more just to kind of highlight the concepts we're going to talk about. I think about resiliency in these 4 categories, and it starts kind of at the very bottom with those basic needs. So when we think about these things being these categories being the things that can promote resiliency for you. Basic needs are the things in life that you need in order to get through your day. And these are going to look different depending on who you are. So there's nobody that can tell you that your basic need is X, because your basic need might in fact be Y. But some of the things that come to mind when I think about basic needs are things like food on the table, shelter, something over your head every night, the clothing you wear, your income, your employment, a safe environment. And so what that looks like for you might be really, really different from the next person. One of the things that I think has been really interesting to see is I've read some of the more recent studies just from the pandemic that talk about how many people have chosen, not necessarily been forced out of, but chosen to leave the workforce because they feel it's more important to have their children at home and not in a classroom. They want their kids to be e-learning, but then as a parent, they need to be then in the home because the kids are in the home during the day. And those are people who have essentially identified that one of their basic needs is safety, right? Is that their home feels safer to them than a classroom or to a work environment. And that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who chose to send their kids to school doesn't value safety, but we prioritize different things. There are people who are going to prioritize a basic level of income that they need to survive and say, we can't do things without this. So this is what we're going to prioritize, and this is what we're going to put first. One of the other things that we saw very early on in the pandemic, and it carried through a little bit, was when products started flying off the shelves. So like when you couldn't get toilet paper and when you could not find a Lysol wipe to save your life. The reason that a lot of that flew off the shelves at the rate that it did is that there were a huge number of people, a huge percentage of the population here in the United States and worldwide, who considered those things to be basic needs, that they couldn't get through their day without them. And the fear of running out of those things was enough for them to say, nope, I need 14 of them. So if you have 72 rolls of toilet paper in your house or 186, or you're like me and I still can't stop buying Lysol wipes because I can't. Every time I see them, I gather them up. Those are things that we've convinced ourselves, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean in a very realistic way. Those we have decided that those are the things that we need at that basic level to survive this and to get through this. One of the things I've always gone back to is I buy those Lysol wipes in this high volume because I at a basic level fear that my kids' school is going to run out of them. And then that way I have a supply that I can send and be like, don't worry, your classroom can be cleaned because like I will send you the Lysol wipes. And so for me, that's that basic need level, right? And so every single one of these components of basic needs is going to be different. Like I said, some of you are going to set like a threshold level of income that makes you feel safe and secure. And some of you are going to identify where you're okay with going, where you're physically okay with being right now. Someone else's house might not be okay. Your own home might be the basic need, and that's it. That's where we're going. We're not spending time in other people's houses. And so when we think about those basic needs, again, it's just important to understand what they are to you. You shouldn't necessarily spend your time thinking about what other people's basic needs are, or judging them. I know a lot of times, like we can enter into a space where we do a lot of judging. And so really being intentional with just understanding what these things are for you and putting them in context for you. What do you need to get through your day? And make sure that you have access to them. That's a huge part of resiliency, is knowing that you have access to the things that you're going to need every single day to manage this pandemic. When we think about that kind of next layer, which is the connections layer, connections is about people. This is about where and what do you participate in and who are you connecting with? This is a huge, huge part of the pandemic, and it took a huge toll on people, because part of what we were asked to do was not be in each other's spaces anymore, right? So all these things where we very normally made connections before, our work environment, social events, religious activities, all of those things where people were a part of it, and people way closer than 6 feet were a part of it. Now we've been asked to kind of say, oh, don't touch, don't get closer than 6 feet, shut down all the things where you might have gathered in big groups. And so part of resiliency is having to find a way to establish some of those connections. And we're challenged with that. And I think many of us have recognized the value of things like we can do things virtually, right? Zoom and different other different softwares and platforms that we can use to do this, all the new apps that have been released this year for people to stay connected, and the things that were always there before. We have to build on them, because what we know about resiliency is the connections between you and other people are a really, really important part of this. So this is friends, it's family, it's peers, coworkers. It could be the random guy walking down the street that you just, want to wave and say hi to, just so they feel like they have some sort of connection as well. The important part of this is to continue to build your network. So what you don't want to do is just stop and say, I got plenty of friends, or, my family's here and we're good, or I've got my 7 people at work that I like to talk to. What's really important from a resiliency standpoint is to continue to make those connections and to not stop making new connections just because you feel like you've already got enough. The more connections that you have right now, the better position that you're going to be in to come out of this on the other end of this tunnel that is COVID, and be very resilient to those pieces of the puzzle. The reason this is so important, there have already been some studies on this, like during the pandemic. So the British Journal of Health Psychology has been doing an ongoing study that kind of just came to its conclusion late in 2020. So they started it right when the pandemic hit, and they did this months-long study specifically looking at the pandemic and looking at social connectedness. And what they found was higher levels of social connectedness are associated with lower levels of distress, which is good. Higher levels of social connectedness are also associated with lower levels of fatigue. So the more connections you have, the less tired and lethargic you're going to feel all the time. Their basic conclusions at the end of the study was that social connectedness essentially is an imperative piece of the puzzle for COVID. It is super important. Everything that shows us that the more we increase our social connections, the less likely we are to feel distressed, to feel lethargic, to feel too tired, to feel worn out. And that was a during COVID study. So something that they've been starting to do now. There's not a ton out there yet. I'm sure we'll be seeing studies on that for years to come, but a really cool one that's been peer reviewed already, and is basically saying that these connections are a huge piece of the puzzle, right? The next piece of this is to really think about strengths, and to think about where you identify strengths for yourself. And resiliency is only going to be sustainable if you recognize and build on the things that you're already good at. So being able to kind of take time out and say, what am I good at? Where do I have confidence? What if other people told me that is a positive attribute of mine? Those are our strengths. And we have to be willing to kind of recognize what those are, and we have to be able to build on them. So you should be able to recognize, what are you good at? What's the thing about your job that you're the best at that you might be able to develop and fine tune a little bit more? What are you competent in? Are you good at, and it doesn't have to be work related, but it certainly can be. Are you good at being a parent right now? Are you good at being a good listener? Are you good at validation? Are you good at, software? Are you the technology person who can help maybe somebody figure out Zoom calls? Are you the person who, always has a cool, innovative idea? Are you the person that likes to be outdoors and maybe lends some ideas to maybe somebody who has never really been an outdoorsy person, but COVID has kind of demanded that we spend a little bit more time outside? The other piece of strengths is, what do you like? Because you can be good at something and hate it. And I'll tell you that, like, if you're good at something, but you hate it, it's probably not going to be the best thing to grow right now, because who wants to be doing something they hate? And so think about the things that you're good at, those strengths you can build on, and which ones you actually like and you see as positives in your life. Getting to focus on those things right now is a huge part of resilience. And unfortunately, what happens is people tend to fall into the rut of thinking about their weaknesses. And it's not people because of COVID. It's honestly very common for people to go to, I'm not good at this, somebody help me fix it. And I would argue instead that instead of like, let's fix something like negativity, let's grow something that you're already good at and that you already feel strongly about and that you feel confident and competent in. And that's going to help you with resiliency more than anything else. The last part of this pyramid, if you will, is well-being. And well-being has a lot of different factors that kind of come into it. A lot of it is where do you find meaning? Where do you find hope? So when I think about meaning, I think about what in your life gives you that meaning. Is it family? Is it connections spiritually? Is it the job and the work that you do? Is it the volunteerism that you're contributing to? Is it giving back to your community? Is it just those few minutes at the end of the day where you feel worn out, but you take that extra time to do, the X factor that helps with that well-being? This could be family related. Well-being can be work related. Again, it can be volunteer focused. One of the things I also think about with well-being is how we manage some of this stress and anxiety in your life. And I've talked about this in a couple of other presentations in the past, but one of the things that I think is really important when I think about well-being is how do you respond to the stress that you feel? And so there's really two big pieces of the puzzle when it comes to stress. You're either a mind stressor or you're a body stressor. If you're a mind stressor, you're going to do things like you're going to have racing thoughts and you're going to what if all the time. You're going to go to the worst case scenario and you're going to troubleshoot everything that could possibly happen until you come up with, okay, I feel better now because I've troubleshooted all of that. And that tends to be how people manifest like mind stress. There are also people who manifest their stress through their body. And so these are people who, instead of those racing thoughts and their mind going a mile a minute and the what ifing, they experience stress differently, and they experience it in the form of physical pain, nail biting, nausea, feeling anxious and can't sit still. Their hands maybe shake a little bit. They have to get up and move around. Those are people who are really manifesting all their stress through their body. And so if you're going to think about well-being as in that kind of stress management kind of way, to think about like, how do you then respond? Because if you're a mind stressor, so if you're the what ifer, you're the person who's going to the extreme to run through every possible scenario in your head, there are going to be things that are better for you from a well-being standpoint to take on. And what I mean by that is you're going to want to focus your activities, your management of that stress around activities that actually stimulate your mind. So things like reading, puzzles, board games, music, the things that are going to drive right to your brain. And if you tend to be more of that body stressor, the person who's nail biting and can't sit still and has nausea and, just wants to get up and move around, the things that are probably going to help you a little bit more are the things that are going to target your body. So things like exercise, deep breathing, getting fresh air, yoga, although yoga can go both ways because it's about the mind too. But targeting those different areas based on the type of stress or how you're manifesting the stress is really important piece of well-being. So I want to talk about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about with well-being is this idea of optimism. So there's a lot of research that talks about glass half full and how optimistic can you be. And I think that optimism is certainly a good thing. I think that people who can kind of say, you know what, we have to be able to look forward and know what's coming and know that there is kind of an end to this in sight. I think that's good. But I also think that, and I'm going to share a story here in a minute, but I also think that optimism, if we're not careful, really, if we're not paying attention to what's happening right now, optimism can sometimes feel a little unrealistic. And so I'll share this kind of story. It's not my story. It's certainly just something I came across while I've been reading different books over the course of my life. But really leadership book from a number of years ago called Good to Great, written by a guy named Jim Collins. And in it, he talks about a gentleman whose name is Jim Stockdale. And Jim Stockdale is a war hero. He is I believe an admiral, and he was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And he had some really interesting insights on optimism and what it means. And he talked a lot about his experience as a prisoner of war. And somebody was interviewing him in this book, and they asked him, like, well, who were the people who didn't survive? Like, you know, you were in this, you know, you're a POW, you were POW for 8 years, you were tortured, there's all this bad stuff happening, you know, you survived, but some others didn't. Like, you know, who were the people who didn't survive? And one of the things that Jim Stockdale said was the people who were perpetually optimistic struggled to survive. And that contradicts sometimes what goes through my mind, because I'm thinking, no, you got to be optimistic if you're going to get through things and you're going to come out on the other side of this. And it confused the author of the book too, who said, well, like, tell me about that, because you just got done telling me that, like, it's important to like, you know that you'll prevail. And he said, well, there's a difference. And he, the quote he used, and I'll read you the quote is, you should never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And the way that he chose to explain that was to say, the people who were in that, who were prisoners of war with him, who set like dates, we'll be out at Christmas, we'll be out by Easter, we'll be out by Thanksgiving, we'll be out by the 4th of July. My birthday's in a month, we'll be out of here by then. He said those were the people who couldn't confront that in that reality they were in, that might not actually happen. They were so fixed on dates and we will be out by this point in time, that every time one of those target dates got hit and passed and they were still POWs, it hit them solidly in the heart and the mind. And Stockdale said, those are the people who died of a broken heart, because they kept setting themselves up for these unrealistic dates because they couldn't recognize the current reality, which was, we don't know when we will get out of here. And so one of the things that Stockdale talked about was, I never doubted that I would get out, but I didn't set unrealistic expectations about when. And I think that really, it's a very different scenario. It's prisoner of war scenario. But I think that those concepts really make a lot of sense right now with the pandemic. We have facts in front of us. We have a vaccine, but we don't know how many people are actually going to choose to take it. We don't have a vaccine for children, and we don't know when one will be ready. We don't know when masks will end. We don't have an end date. These are all facts with this pandemic. And I'm certainly not telling you this to be like a downer, because I do think that knowing that there is an end is important. But I think we have to really be intentional about not saying like, it'll be a month, it'll be 2 months. Because when we start to put dates on things, and when we start to attach meaning to those things, and those dates come and go and nothing has really improved, or at least it hasn't improved much, it can really take a hit to our ability to be resilient and to move forward and to stay optimistic. So I think optimism is important. I just think we have to be very careful about how we choose to frame that optimism, so that we can continue to move forward, knowing that the facts right now are that we don't know when this will end. but we can feel very confident that yes, there will be an end, right? And if we follow that kind of thinking of Jim Stockdale, we're going to come out on the other side of this survivors and not, kind of feeling deflated or defeated because we can't hit these dates in our mind that we've made or created. So just kind of a different way to think about some of that well-being that I wanted to share. The next thing I wanted to just talk a little bit about is resiliency in context. Just a couple things on this. I have a lot of people who've told me over the course of time, like, I do everything, Sarah, I've got all of that figured out. Like, I feel like I know my strengths. I feel like I've made connections, feel like I have the basic needs, feel like my well-being is like right in the right place. So like, why do I not feel resilient? And so my next piece of this is to really just think about the quality of those layers of the pyramid, if you will. If you have connections with people, and all of those connections with people, if all of those people are being negative all the time or not supportive of you, then how valuable is the connection? Part of this is about meaning making and making sure that establishing those connections, that those connections actually do something positive for you. I've been around people where I can say, hey, I've got a ton of friends, I got a ton of peers, I got a ton of coworkers, but if all of them are always so down on everything that's happening, then those connections aren't helping me. And so part of looking at this, these layers, is identifying the quality of those pieces, specifically with the connections, specifically with the well-being aspects, really important part of the puzzle, right? And I think that, so just taking some extra time to evaluate the quality of those different things that you've kind of thought through and that you've kind of put together for yourself is going to be a really important piece of the puzzle, because you can have all those things, but if they aren't positive versions of those things, they're not going to help you all that much in the long run. I also like to just talk briefly about technology. Technology is an excellent way to build some of those connections, all sorts of different ways to stay connected with people, things that existed pre-pandemic, FaceTime, different social media platforms, video apps, health and wellness apps. And really, the research has shown that technology has reduced feelings of isolation and loneliness, but it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. Technology can also significantly contribute to information overload. A lot of the more recent studies have shown that while it's good for you to stay informed, some of us tend to go overboard and we want all the information all the time, and that excessive or overindulgent consumption of all of that information that's out there via technology can really negatively impact our ability to stay resilient. And so the idea behind this is really to just think about moderation. Find one or two key websites that have the reputable information that you want, go back to them. Stay away from blanket Google searches that are just going to information overload you with stuff that may or may not be true, because we know that anything can exist on the internet. So just really being cautionary about, kind of how we're leveraging some of that technology. And the last thing that I really just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is this idea of resiliency is not necessarily about, it's not synonymous to going back to what we were used to before. There is a really, as I kind of did some research on some of this resiliency over the past few months, I came across a woman, and her name's Froma Walsh. She is based out of Chicago. She's a very well-respected researcher and author on resiliency. And currently she's the head of the Chicago Center for Family Health. She's written well over 100 books on the topic of resiliency. And she has this concept of bounce back versus bounce forward. And I think it's a really cool concept. She talks about this idea that, like, we're not necessarily going to go back to the way things were pre-pandemic, and that shouldn't be our target with resiliency. Instead, resiliency has to be about how we adjust or how we bounce forward to what the world is going to be after the pandemic. And some of the parallels that she kind of talked about, and she compared it at points to what happened at airports pre and post 9/11. So if you think about pre 9/11, you could go into any airport, you could walk up to a gate, you didn't have to have a ticket, you didn't need any of that. And post 9/11, the United States, instigated all of these, or activated all these different rules where now you need a boarding pass, and lots more screening and full body scans and things like that. We never went back after we eliminated the threat, right? So just because we eliminated the most pressing threat in the years following 9/11, we didn't go back and say, okay, well, now we can go back to like lax airport security. That didn't happen. We adjusted, we bounced forward, and that became our new reality. One of the other things that she talked a little bit about was the way that airlines shifted. So pre 9/11, most airlines focus, 99% of airlines' main number one priority was customer service. And post 9/11, it became safety. And so many of them still pride themselves on customer service, but it became less of the focus, and the new norm became about safety. And so you saw all sorts of protocols change while you sit on an airplane now post 9/11. And those are things we never went back to. It's been almost 20 years. We haven't gone back. We're not going to go back. This became our reality. And so when we think about COVID, we have to think about, how are we going to bounce forward and adjust to things? How this may systematically change the way we think about how close we let somebody to us. Masks might become a more recognizable permanent fixture in our world for years to come, in more environments than we ever would have seen them before. Health and safety protocols for schools might not go back to what they were before. They may adjust and take on a different meaning post-COVID. And so when we think about resiliency, we have to think about that bounce forward, and how do we adjust to what this is going to become, as opposed to assuming that it's going to go back to the way it was. Because I think that if we go there and we think it's just going to go back to the way it was a year and a couple months ago, then that's really going to take a hit on our resiliency when it doesn't end up happening that way. So I wanted to share some of her work. She's done an outstanding amount of research in resiliency. She really focuses on kids and families, but she's done a little bit now on pandemic related things. So again, just kind of wanted to share that with all of you. And I did see in the chat, there were, somebody had asked about the link to the research, which should be at the back of the slides. Everything that we cited on the connectedness, I think the connections is what people were asking about, should be at the back of that on the very last slide. So I'll share that here at the end. And I've reached to the end of the presentation. I wanted to make sure we had some time to field any questions that any of you might have. And feel free to put them in the chat, and we can start with that.
Sarah, it looks like there's one here. Aren't those who are raised in abusive and hostile homes less likely to be able to learn or acquire resiliency?
So it's really interesting. The study that we looked at for this talked about, that family history doesn't necessarily have there's not a significant link. So if you have family history of mental health, or you have family history of poverty, those things are less likely to impact you, or those things are less likely to negatively impact resiliency. When it comes to if you were actually abused yourself, the research that I came across, some of the research, it's kind of gone, I will say it's gone back and forth over the years. If you had asked me 10 years ago, I'd say, oh, yep, the research is really showing that, kids who grew up in abusive homes can really struggle with resiliency. The more recent research is actually really finding that that's not true, that those things like how they're able in their adolescence and young adult years to build some of that social connectedness and make meaning are actually going to be stronger indicators of resiliency than any family history. It really depends on when you're looking at the research, because again, if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I would have given you a totally different answer than what I'm giving you today.
At this point, those are the only questions that I see. Oh, here's one. Would the research support the idea that perhaps those from abusive, hostile, or trauma-filled environments and are successful have resiliency coupled with coping mechanisms?
Okay, hold on, I gotta read it again.
Okay.
Research support. Damn, there's those. I'm not entirely sure. I think I'm following the question right. So if people are in those abusive, hostile, trauma-filled environments and are now successful, have resiliency coupled with coping mechanisms. I think that if I'm understanding the question right, it's, can resiliency does it happen on its own, or does it have to be paired with like people being intentional about their coping mechanisms? And I think they go hand in hand. I think the only way we maintain our ability to be resilient is to be intentional about what kind of things that we are doing to cope. So if you think about some of those things on that pyramid, or even just going beyond that, I saw somebody earlier, they said it was a shameless plug, but they're doing some sort of like mindfulness retreat. Stuff like that is going, I mean, shameless plug or not, that's an amazing opportunity. Mindfulness is an excellent coping skill to start leveraging to try to stay resilient and to maintain some sort of mental health stability. So I think when you pair, I think that resiliency, while there's a lot that supports that, you know, it's about building connections and things like that, we have to be intentional about how we continue to do it with some of those coping mechanisms. I see somebody put in the chat that Oprah suggests that her success was driven by her childhood trauma because her coping mechanism was excelling via education. I think that's exactly right. I think we hear tons of stories about people who have really struggled and have come out on the other side of this. And again, it just supports the research that just because you grew up in maybe a not strong environment, or even a dangerous or traumatic environment, doesn't mean that you can't be resilient. That resilience can be learned and can be taught. And some of that comes from within. Some of us have to have that kind of internal motivation and spark to do it. But again, if people are willing to take that on, then resilience is certainly can be a factor for people as they continue to be successful.
Sarah, someone asked, how can we help others increase their resiliency?
Yeah. So I think that when we think about like how best to help others, and I've talked about this, those of you, obviously none of you know me, but my background is clinical. I spent a long time doing counseling. Validation is a huge part of what you can do for somebody else. Tell them it's okay to have a bad day. Tell them that it is okay to be angry. Tell them it's okay to be so frustrated by this pandemic that if they want to, you know, scream it out, they can scream it out. The more we validate how people are feeling right now, the more it's going to normalize that they are not alone, that if they continue to struggle, that there are people out there who are willing to listen. It's really okay you can validate anger, you can validate frustration, you can validate happiness and joy. There's nothing wrong with any emotion anybody's feeling right now. Again, it's what they choose to do with it. And they're actually more likely to do something healthy with their anger if you tell them anger is okay, versus if you don't say anything, that anger bottles up because they don't think it's okay to feel angry, and it sits at the bottom of their stomach, and then one day it just explodes all over the place. That's more harmful for them than if they hear you say, hey, it's okay that you're frustrated and it's okay that you're angry. Being willing to listen and just not be the talker for a while. If you see somebody really struggling around you, you can just offer an ear and just say, hey, no judgments. I won't try to interject my bad day on you. I just, you know, if you're struggling, I'll be there. I can listen. I'm happy to listen. Those are the two, more than anything else, listening and validating are going to help somebody right now.
Okay. I think that is all for now. We are going to wrap up. It's 1 o'clock and we'll let everybody get back to work. Sarah and Purvi, thank you so much for presenting today. I will send out the slides to all the attendees today after I receive that from Sarah. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email, hball@illinois.edu. And we thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Purvi.